Good morning, everybody. Welcome to today's Unlocking Innovation session. Today, we're going to focus on the challenge of building back better for the passenger. So on my next slide is our thanks to our partners in this event. So thank you to Network Rail and the UK Rail Research and Innovation Network for supporting the Unlocking Innovation programme, which is open to everybody in the industry and importantly free on the door. So we hope you're enjoying it today. So on the next slide, we're going to look at the agenda for the next couple of days. So shortly, we're going to be doing our Building Back Better for the Passengers keynote session. And this afternoon, we're focusing on stations of the future. And as with Rolling Stock of the Future tomorrow, these sessions are open, interactive sessions to get the conversation going on these topics. So tomorrow we have our keynote session on the UK Rail Research and Innovation Network and customer experience. And as I say, in each afternoon, we have open networking sessions where those organizations on the client side with the challenges and innovators can get together and hopefully magic will happen and we'll start to address some of the challenges across the industry in those areas. So moving on to the next slide, our agenda today is up there for you to see, but if I can just make a few introductory remarks about why we've chosen this topic area. I mean, obviously, as we are now today in the depths of a pandemic, albeit with light at the end of the tunnel with the vaccine, we find ourselves in a situation where railway patronage is down as much as 95%. But that's against a background where government are, for understandable reasons, actively discouraging people from unnecessary travel on public transport. And to look at it more optimistically, I observe that actually car use has come back very strongly and is at or near pre-pandemic levels. And that suggests to me that people still want to travel. So I'm optimistic that when our messaging changes about how we should use public transport, that passengers will actually come back. I'm also optimistic that we need to continue with our investment programs because if we were to slacken off our investment programs, reflecting the trying to address the amount of funding that the government are necessarily having to put into the railway, I think that would be very short-sighted because the gestation period of investment programs on the railway is such that if we delay them, patronage will have come back and the projects the infrastructure won't be there to support that. So we shouldn't slow down our investment program. And of course, investment programs are part of building back better. So to me, one thing is clear and obviously topical today, that we need to innovate out of the situation that we find ourselves in. And so that leads us, I think, neatly into the scene setting. And if I can move to our first presenter, can I introduce Anthony Smith, the Chief Executive of Transport Focus, and Anthony's going to talk about putting the customer first and how we adapt to the needs of the passenger in the post-COVID world. So Anthony, over to you.
David, thank you very much indeed. And thank you very much to the Railway Industry Association for the chance to kick today off. It's great to see so many of you out there today. I wish we were talking face to face, but this is second best, but it's great. And recognise quite a few names out there, so hello. Transport Focus. Some of you know us, some of you probably don't. We're the independent statutory consumer watchdog for Britain's rail passengers, bus, coach and tram passengers and users of Highways England's roads. So we've got a very multimodal view across transport, which I think is helpful. We're very much a consumer organisation. We don't try and tell people how to travel. We just try and improve their transport experience. We aim to be useful to all of you who are making all the decisions and trying to make things better for passengers. And above all else, we use evidence to drive our argument. So it's not just what happened to me last week. We've actually got a stack of evidence. And you'll be very pleased to know that I've only got one slide today, which I'll come on to later. But all of the things I'm going to talk about are on our website. They're all located on our data hub where you can search, you can create your own questions, you can craft your own data out of this. So it's all out there for you to use. And I think David's intro was very spot on. We're in a really strange time. And thinking about what to say today, it's very difficult to know how to frame this debate in a way, because we're in such an uncertain external environment. We don't know what's going to happen when. And I think there are three periods we've got to think about. There are still people traveling now. We're still representing them. Their voice still needs to be heard, despite the government's very clear advice, don't travel unless you have to. There are people out there who have to travel. And it was interesting last night, there's a big building site near where I live, and I was cycling past last night, and at about 5 o'clock, there are about 30 very large builders waiting at the bus stop to catch the G1 bus up to Clapham South, presumably, where they're going to get on the tube. And the thought of those 30 builders getting onto the bus, I'm not sure quite how that was going to work for social distancing, as it's quite a small bus, but it's really important to remember there are people out there who have to travel at the moment, and we need to understand what's happening to them and what their needs are. We're then going to go, I think, into a very messy kind of interim period where it's not quite clear what's happening with vaccines and whatever. Then hopefully at some point in the future, we're going to get a degree of stability. But I think it's very important just to start this debate to think, right, what do we know now? What do we know for sure now? Now, back in last March, like many of you, we were cut off from our usual supply of information coming from the front line of what passengers were experiencing. We used to do a lot of face-to-face survey work, which involved handing out questionnaires because it was the only way to get representative samples. And of course, all of that ceased last March. And so we had to think, right, how are we going to get some feedback from the front line? Because this is going to be crucial for the industry in terms of understanding what's going on to its customers. So we set up a weekly, it's once every fortnight at the moment because things are quieter, but it's an omnibus survey every weekend, 2,000 adults right across Great Britain, asking them about either their travel experience, and of course it includes driving as well, but also what they were thinking about travel and how they were sort of hearing some of the government messages. And we've now got about 8 months worth of data from that, and it's a very useful sort of store, and you can see what happened during the various lockdowns, the various tiers as things changed. And it paints a very strong picture, and we supplemented that. We set up some online communities, basically online focus groups of rail, bus and car drivers, rail and bus passengers and car drivers, and we use those communities to kind of dig into this stuff in more depth. And then we supplemented that ultimately as well with our standing transport user panel, which is an online digital panel of people who we use to ping questions to and can get very fast responses from. So I think we've built quite a good sort of feedback loop into the current system. And as I say, do go and have a look at it on our data hub. It's all there. So where have we got to at this point? The latest results from the omnibus will be loaded up to our website and the data hub tomorrow. And you'll be able to see that obviously very few people are traveling at the moment, but those who are traveling, actually, 9 out of 10 roughly say the experience is okay. And I think that reflects the fact that the rail industry it's had a good crisis in many ways. It's done well. Obviously, it's been very heavily supported by the government, which has kept everything rolling, kept everything moving. But passengers, by and large, the ones who are traveling, say they're feeling safe. And that's been consistent right across the last 8 or 9 months. Why are they saying they're safe? I think is very important and needs to be held onto in talking about the future. First of all, absolutely key is the ability to socially distance. Obviously, that's not very difficult at the moment as there are very few passengers, but the need to be distant from others and not to be crowded at stations and on trains is absolutely paramount. Secondly, of course, the behaviour of other passengers is very important, especially as regards face coverings. And the non-wearing or the partial wearing of face coverings really has an impact on my journey because it is my journey and it's my health. And thirdly, the visible cleanliness of the services is very, very important as well. So I think there's 3 elements there that are really worth bearing in mind for the future. And of course, the vast majority of people who are not travelling, they are reporting that they're listening to government messaging. I think some people probably don't want to travel and so, probably don't want to go back to commuting again quite in the way they did before. So are saying it doesn't feel safe. I think it's quite important to ultimately try and tease some of that out. But as David said, there's plenty of people driving at the moment. And as that old song goes, I feel safest in my car. And that does seem to be the kind of prevailing mood at the moment. So As we move into the kind of interim period, which perhaps we'll move into after the Prime Minister speaks in February, and then we have hopefully a sort of partial unlocking from March onwards, we're obviously going to have some vaccines, some variants, some false starts. How people say they're going to behave and how they actually behave is going to be very interesting. I think, as David's right, there's going to be a massive pent-up desire to get around and to travel. I mean, at the moment, sort of going half a mile away from home feels like a sort of really quite exciting experience. And especially as the weather starts to improve and people might head to the coast for staycations, it's going to be a very interesting period before the sort of full unlocking, whenever that happens. But I think when the time is right and when the future, when it is right for people to travel more en masse, I think the industry's got some very simple things to perhaps think about. First of all, I mean, there's no difference in some ways to the way it always has been. You've got to have the right product at the right price. It's the same as virtually any retail kind of experience. And I think there are certain things we need to start thinking about now to make sure that anybody who wants to use rail in the future, the barriers are lowered. I think rail ticketing reform, the fares retailing reform, is very, very important in that respect. This has been under the radar for a very long time. It's been talked about for a long time. Now is the time to do it. The moons are in alignment. All of the revenue risk sits with the government. It's now the time to get those flexible season tickets worked out so that people can use them when they can. Get some promotions thought about. I don't subscribe to this belief that if you stack them high and sell them cheap, that's wrong. I don't think that devalues the product. The key is getting people back into the habit of using rail. We've all got out of the habit, and habits, once they're formed, they're very hard to break again. And ultimately, we do need long-term reform of the fares and ticketing system, moving towards single leg pricing, and getting everything digital and getting everything online so that people can know what they've got, what the restrictions are, etc., etc. The basic service, as ever, it's got to be reliable. That was always the key driver of satisfaction pre-COVID. It's going to be the key driver afterwards, because if you don't have a reliable service, people are not getting the basics of what they bought from the ticket. And of course, unreliability leads to crowding. We don't want crowding. It's the key driver, one of the key drivers of satisfaction at the moment. Clean, socially distanced, all of the basics have got to be in place very, very consistently. And I think what we're going to try and do is really reinforce that virtuous circle, that when people can start traveling again, we get feedback from the front line. People tend to take their news and their opinions most faithfully from those who they know and those who they trust around them, friends and family. So everybody who has a good experience, you want to capture them, get the feedback, they will tell other people, and we can independently report on that fact that, you know, in the front line, this is how it's going. And I think getting that virtuous circle of feedback is going to be very, very important. And we will replace all the old surveys that we did, the National Rail Passenger Survey and others, with new surveys that are more digital. They're always on, and they're representative enough. They might not be quite as representative as the old surveys, but they'll be representative enough for people to make decisions on. So I think the key to the future is winning back passenger by passenger, getting them back one by one, getting the feedback from them, and making sure that that feedback is fed through the system, and that stakeholders' opinion formers know what passengers are saying in the front line. And perhaps if I could just have the one slide that I do have, we have tried to summarize all this in our latest report, which came out last week. I thoroughly recommend you have a look at this. We've tried to summarize everything we've learned from the last 8 or so months, and we've boiled it down to these 5 points, which I've hopefully just give you a very keen sense about what it is that passengers are looking for from the moment in terms of cleanliness, social distance, face coverings, etc. And then when the time is right, what they might be looking for in future in terms of flexible fares, getting the product right, and then offers and promotions to tempt people back. So please do go and have a look at that report. It's called Lessons from COVID, and that hopefully that one slide sort of summarizes everything that I've been trying to say. I think in the longer term, the industry is going to have some real challenges. It's going to be very interesting. The leisure market is probably going to be more important. One of the things we do know, I think, is that we'll probably be traveling less in terms of commuting and less in terms of long distance business travel. How much less and when that will be is a moot point. But I think the consensus is there's going to be less. But the leisure market could be much stronger. And of course, the rail industry at the moment is geared more around commuters, arguably, than the leisure market. So longer longer term, we might have to do engineering differently. Rather than doing it at the weekends when the leisure market's strong, you might have to do it on Tuesday night or something. The 9 to 5 is gone. Do we need a peak during the day? You know, the current ticketing structure might create quite false bunching and quite false peaks when it's not needed. Perhaps we don't need a peak anymore. There might be less railway, let's be honest. The people are not going to rush back, and the peak might not need to be serviced in quite the way that it was, so it could look quite different. Staffing is still going to be important. People want the visible reassurance of staff, and tech and innovation is going to play a role, either telling people when services are crowded, telling people when they're less busy, and of course really getting tech applied to ticketing and technology. And I think also it's worth bearing in mind that the health crisis will hopefully pass at some point, but the climate crisis is not going away. We're going to come back to the climate crisis. And it's been very interesting watching David Attenborough's programs about the perfect planet, because, you know, he has now sort of tuned up his kind of warnings about the climate and, you know, the impact that we're having on the planet. And the rail's role in helping people choose more sustainable travel options is going to be very, very important in the future. But they will only choose sustainable travel options if it's the right choice for them, it's the right consumer choice, it's the right product at the right price, and above all else, it comes back reliable. So thank you very much indeed for listening, and very much looking forward to taking part in the debate later. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Anthony. That's a really, really good introduction. You've set the scene very well. You're clearly setting out the issues as passengers see them both now and in the future, and set the challenge, set the bar for the industry. So thank you for that introduction. And we'll have Q&A later after all the presentations. So if the audience have got questions, then please put them in the chat dialogue, and we'll pick those up later. Moving forward now, so we've set the scene with Anthony. Moving forward to how are we going to start dealing with it? Network Rail have been running a Putting Passengers First program for a number of years, and I'm delighted to introduce Charlie Wallace, who's the Freight National Passenger Operations and Customer Director at Network Rail, and also has a very strong TOC and operations background. So I'm sure we'll get some very pertinent insights from Charlie. So Charlie, over to you.
Thanks very much. Thank you very much for having me today to talk about how we're getting on with our putting passengers first, and freight users, I should say, and what our current priorities are. Putting passengers first is one of the main reasons I joined Network Rail last year, although it feels like a long time ago now. When I heard about the change in the culture from our Chief Executive, Andrew Haynes, I really wanted to be involved in that, and it was exciting as it was a new chapter for Network Rail in that Network Rail story. So the journey began in 2019 in a very different world to the one that we're living in now. And I'll discuss that in the next slide, please. But I'm pleased to report that despite the many challenges, we've made good progress with new ways of working already reaping rewards for our customers and passengers. And I hope you as suppliers have also seen the benefits too. I'll balance that with full appreciation that all of us here today, still have a very long way to go yet on this journey. The COVID-19 pandemic continues to have a significant and wide-reaching impact, both in our country and on our railway. As a result, it's right that we continue to identify opportunities for efficiencies and to improve how we work and what we deliver for passengers and freight users. Next slide, please. It's not long to go before the anniversary, and I know that's not the best word in this sense, but I'll use it anyway, of 1 year of working from home. For those of us who have had to, it reminded me of an article I saw a couple of days ago, which was headlined, "Almost a year working from home. Maybe it's time for my family's performance review." But of course, not all of us work from home. So as the snow and icy conditions continue to impact the country and the railway, I'd like to pay tribute to our operational colleagues, both at Network Rail and across our supply chain, who turn up on site no matter what the weather conditions to get people and goods to where they need to be safely and on time. And I'd like to thank all of our supply chain partners, from top tier contractors to the many SMEs across the country, for helping us to keep running and improving the railway. One of our key priorities is supporting the supply chain as much as possible throughout the pandemic, whether it's through faster payments or by working to ensure standards are there for the right reasons and aren't obstacles in ways of working more efficiently, more sustainably and more ethically, and very much more safely. Together, we've kept employment, training and investment going, which is crucial in tough times like this. Next slide, please. By way of a quick recap, I'll briefly summarise where we are today with the Putting Passengers First programme. After our CEO, Andrew, joined Network Rail in the summer of 2018, one of the first things he did was a 100-day review of the organisation that looked at three main things: how to provide the best possible service for passengers and freight users, how to ensure we deliver the promises we've made for the current control period, which covers 2019 to 24, and how to improve the way we work together and with industry. Andrew and his team met thousands of people at sites, depots and desks across the country, and individuals and groups throughout the industry, to find out what was working and what wasn't. They had to acknowledge some hard truths. Fundamental things like train service performance, our promise to passengers, our promise to customers were just not good enough, and too often we've been difficult to work with, both with each other and outside of our organisation. What Andrew and the team heard and learned was carefully captured and went on to inform the vision that we've come to know as Putting Passengers First, which very much includes our freight community. The aim was to transform Network Rail from so-called infrastructure company to one that puts customers at the heart of everything we do. Somebody said to me, Network Rail are very much used to moving trains, but not moving passengers, so we wanted to change that. The research and insight that came out of this learning curve are encapsulated and distilled into four simple hearts. And these are: to be able to be on the side of passengers and freight users, to be an easy to engage with and dependable partner, to be a company that colleagues are proud to work for, and to be an instinctive industry leader. That's the theory. You might say that's the easy part, then comes the doing. We've launched this cultural change programme, but now we need to live it. And that's where we are today. And I'll discuss this more on the next slide, please. From a reorg standpoint, one of the biggest changes we've implemented was the formation of our new regions and routes. In June 2019, we created 5 new regions, which has its own managing director. So that decision making is now more localised. And within Network Rail, we call it the power of 6. So we have our 5 regions and we have our group function centrally. And they're there to support the regions in any local decision making they have. Each region plans and responds to what passengers want and need from the railway. Where they are, key decisions are no longer made far away from the front line, which means less red tape, less bureaucracy and more improvements for passengers. We are bringing our people closer to those we serve. The focus on local delivery continued through summer 2019 when we established 14 new routes. Within the regions, they are responsible for their own day-to-day delivery of train performance, operations, maintenance and renewals. We have, of course, been building this new culture and focus during the most challenging time our industry has ever seen. And just as well as I believe it's helped us to be more resilient and proactive in our mindset, to be able to react to something that's so devastating that no one saw coming. I think it's the worst ever event that's happened in my lifetime, that's for sure. In a way, our biggest shake-up in years has been tested to the limit. We didn't need hypothetical modelling to tell us putting passengers first was the right thing to do. We've had the real thing. I'm proud that we've kept the momentum going regardless of the pandemic, and I'm proud that we've brought the industry far closer together. We've worked very much as one industry, one that's sometimes seen as disparate and fragmented. And as I've said, putting passengers first is an ongoing journey, but I think it's a journey that our people are starting to feel is worth making, with all the challenges and opportunities to come and momentous and memorable journeys. Next slide, please. Continuing with the hearts motif, I'd like to highlight what I'm calling our top 4 hearts of the matter priorities. The context is clear. Passenger numbers are down, revenue is down, and we have high levels of necessary government subsidy. We've heard that from Anthony already this morning. We know that the industry needs to respond to these challenges, and Network Rail is committed to playing its part. We're also acutely aware of our responsibility to deliver for public money, which is why we must be able to demonstrate financial rigour and efficiency. Our heart of the matter priorities are to encourage passengers back to our network once restrictions are lifted, demonstrating the safety precautions which have been put in place throughout the pandemic. And I firmly believe passengers will come back. It may be a very different landscape for us to deal with, and I believe passengers will be more demanding and more challenging. But we need to be ready for that, and we need to give the confidence to our passengers and our customers that we've changed things for them. We need to support the change in the culture of our workforce, focusing on service, safety, diversity and inclusion. And I know that you're going to hear from Lorraine Martens later, really living our values. We need to be an efficient, reliable and safe partner, making the case for long-term rail investment, showing how we can support the levelling up and sustainability agenda. In a world of three-word mantras, rail must change. And these are big picture priorities for us. Making the case for rail alone includes supporting rail reform across the industry, showcasing our sustainability credentials, talking about how the railway can contribute to a build back greener recovery for the UK, and showing how we've changed to become a more agile and efficient network. They're also connected. If we can rebuild passenger confidence to return to the railway, no one will be interested in the case for rail, but we know this will take time. And if we don't change the culture and modernise the industry, we will do what we've always done and struggle to become agile and efficient, a partner that prioritises things and makes a huge contribution to the UK economy. Any activity that we undertake should be helping us to achieve these priorities, and within them there are incredible opportunities for our supply chain. Next slide, please. Here I'd like to brazenly reference RIA's own 10 reasons to continue to invest in rail, with a report published in November last year in light of the debate over the pandemic's impact on the future of transport. There are 10 concise reasons to maintain rail investment in the executive summary, and I've borrowed number 10 to focus on. It might not be the most important, but it's to do with time. In that now the time to get to work without impacting services, we should collectively capitalise on this before passenger freight and freight numbers return, although freight has been pretty buoyant throughout the pandemic. It's an important opportunity to look and fix some of the struggling parts of the system. The expertise and innovation that exists across our supply chain will be integral to ensuring we deliver efficiently and high standards. Reliability drives passenger satisfaction, but it's also key to make the most of the capacity available. A system that operates predictably should also allow better for use of capacity. There are areas where I believe we have already made strides in, not just building back better, but simply striving to be better. It's also important to mention that we're building back better before the pandemic, as we'd already had plenty of challenges facing us ahead of CP6. The platform was there, and we were off to a solid start, but it certainly speeded things up, sparked our agility and showed us what more we needed to do. To move away from the abstract, here are a few tangible examples, which is by no means exhaustive list, but their common theme or the DNA that runs through them is that they're very passenger focused. As an industry, we should be proud that we are keeping passengers and trains running throughout this pandemic for those who need to get somewhere, many of them key workers fulfilling vital roles. We're keeping freight trains running to deliver goods, again, many vital and up and down the country. We're putting a new timetable in place in record time. We're providing clean and regularly clean stations and trains with new hygiene standards so that people can feel very safe and confident when travelling. We're providing warmer, friendlier customer service at all our stations through our Love Passengers initiative. And we're delivering approximately £502 million of improvement works and bank holidays alone, in addition to the day-to-day work we do with the supply chain to maintain and improve our railway. We're developing an even greener and cleaner railway with a collaborative cross-industry initiatives like the Environmental Sustainability Strategy and the Traction Decarbonisation Network Strategy. And I'll leave it there before we get ahead of ourselves. But just before I close, I'd like to give a special mention to the aptly named project SPEED, which stands for Swift, Pragmatic and Efficient Enhancement Delivery. I won't go into much detail just now. In fact, this is more of a plug for an up-and-coming event hosted by RIA on behalf of Network Rail and the Department for Transport on 26th of February at 2 p.m. onwards, where you will hear all about it. Project Speed has two core principles at its heart: to have the time and slash the cost of project delivery. This is a place to be if you're looking to understand more about the opportunities to drive efficiency and transform the way we deliver projects in our industry. In our response to the pandemic, we've faced some really tough challenges and learned a thing or two about our industry and about our passengers and customers, and even about ourselves. The pandemic has certainly demonstrated why rail reform is needed and what the railway can do together when we act with one common purpose. We work best when we work together, and we can achieve more. We need to reform so that passengers are put first each and every day, and not just in times of crisis. The best functioning parts of our industry are those where people have clear perspective on what winning looks like, where people's positive, passenger-focused behaviours prevail, despite process and structures, not because of it. Mariana Mazzucato, who's an economist and an author of Mission Economy, in a recent BBC interview said, and I'm paraphrasing, "COVID has given us the opportunity to tear up orthodoxy. I see this as a kind of inspiring permission to embrace creativity and innovation, and in the words of my CEO, to be revolting in the best sense of the word. And I think it's a great platform to rebuild and refocus on, to be responsive to what our passengers want: a clean, a safe, a reliable service every day." Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you very much, Charlie. And I know you've been having problems with your bandwidth, so apologies to the audience if they weren't able to see Charlie speak as well as hear her. But thank you very much. We heard you very clearly. And just to pick out a few points about what you said, I absolutely think you're right that we should be proud of the railway family for having kept the railway running, and for all the hard work that everybody has put in across the whole industry. And one thing that I would draw out is the level of collaboration that we've seen across the industry has been fantastic. And thank you for the couple of mentions of RIA. If I can reciprocate and just say that we would be critical of Network Rail when necessary, but we can't be critical of you during the pandemic. You've been a great client, and the supply chain is very grateful to you for that. Also grateful for you pointing out, as we were highlighting in our 10 key things document, that we need to really focus as an industry on building on that collaboration and demonstrating our efficiency going forward. So thanks again, Charlie. Really helpful and overview there. We move on now, and we of course we have to remember that the railway must be accessible to everybody, and I'm not sure that the railway has always been as good as it could be in welcoming everybody onto the railway. And if I can introduce Lorraine Martens, I'm sure she's going to challenge us to do even better going forward. So Lorraine, over to you, please.
Thank you for that introduction, and also thank you, Anthony and Charlie, really for setting the scene. So what I'm intending to talk about is accessibility considerations post-COVID, but I guess very much so the context has been set by both Anthony and Michael, and many of these things that we're going to talk about now have been historical challenges for us as an organisation. I'm struggling to move on the slide, so if I could get some assistance, that would be really helpful. So if somebody could move the next slide, that would be fantastic. Can I have the next slide? I just wanted to kind of put a bit more context to what we're doing. So what Charlie did really beautifully was kind of give you the kind of current state of play, how we've moved into being much more of a business that's focusing on our passengers. I just want to remind you of the scale of the task for us as a business and as a sector. We've got something like 41,000 employees who are looking after the infrastructure and ably supported by 118,000 contractors. And you will see from this slide, in terms of the volume of bridges, the amount of rail track that we have, the amount of stations that we have, the tunnels, it's an aging infrastructure, the range of retail units, the amount of freight that we move. It's not a simple task, and it wasn't designed for the range of passengers that we know now currently utilize our infrastructure and our trains. And I'd like to echo Charlie's thanks really to all of our employees, our contractors and the train operating companies for doing a sterling job during the pandemic in terms of keeping the train running. For the next slide, I'd like to show you the kind of three key aspects around inclusion, around access and inclusion. And it's part of our diversity and inclusion strategy, which is a 5-year strategy. We think access and inclusion is really the kind of key to giving a better passenger experience, really. And there are 3 elements to it, of which Charlie's given some really useful signals. So putting passengers first is absolutely the essence. As if we have a rail infrastructure that wasn't designed for passengers, our challenge then is to think about how the passenger experience. Also, think about those who struggle the most, in a sense, with our infrastructure, and that's disabled passengers. And it really behoves us to understand the everyday needs of disabled passengers, because when we get it right for disabled people, we get it right for everyone. We also need to recast our thinking about the accessibility of our stations, both in terms of facilities, but we have a fantastic enabler in the accessible travel policy, which I'll go on to discuss a little bit later. But that enabler really sets the bar for the standards of service that we need to be delivering as a rail industry to make sure that the passengers are front and center of our focus. And then underpinning all of that, and I've seen one of the questions around, how you kind of build back better. Communication for us is going to be absolutely key, and how we train our people and build on a better culture, and also work with our passengers, with our partners, and with our passengers to some extent. So on the next slide, I'd like to talk a little bit more about what we need to do and to improve our passenger experience. And you'll see a picture there of somebody who tweeted a really good experience that they had around Stansted Express. And many of you will know that we have been challenged oftentimes in terms of the service that we provide, particularly to disabled people and particularly to older people. And that can range from not communicating effectively, not providing assistance on time, sometimes not getting people off the train so they can get their connections. So those are the things that we know cause real distress and real inconvenience to our passengers. And what we need to do then is to understand the needs of disabled passengers. And those needs are not dissimilar in particular to other passengers. So everybody wants to be safe, everybody wants reliability, everybody needs to have their attention paid to their specific needs. And so it's really important for us that we use a process which we have developed, which is called a diversity impact assessment process. What that does is make us think about the effects of the decisions that we make, and where those decisions may inconvenience people, make us decide what kind of things we can put in its place to mitigate against any inconvenience or disadvantage that we cause. So in terms of putting passengers first, where we think about how we reconfigure the trains, how we do our renewals, how we look at the platforms, how we provide the actual service, the diversity impact assessment process is absolutely key to recalibrating our thinking so that we are thinking, well, how would that affect a disabled passenger? If we close a lift, what alternative do we have? If we've got to change the train runnings, what other transport systems can we do, and how can we do that as seamlessly as possible, and how can we make sure that we're communicating about that so that people aren't inconvenienced? And I guess what we've learned from COVID, because of the reduction of people, we've had some time to augment how we communicate, how we navigate people through our stations and rail infrastructure. And I think we've got a really great opportunity to build on that as we move into the post-COVID period. And a way that we can do that is presented partly in the next slide. So we have a series of good principles of inclusive design. And we're really proud of that policy, because what that does, it means that from the outset, when we're looking at the renewal programs, when we're looking at redesigning our stations, we're thinking about how we can make sure we've considered all of the different constituents that utilize our infrastructure. And that's a really crucial development for us, and something that you will see more of as we're moving post-COVID. So things like wayfinding, making our signage much more intuitive and logical, much more clearer. Thinking about how the foot flow through our stations, making that much more intuitive and logical. All of those things will enhance the passenger experience and also enable people to be as independent as possible in our stations. And we test out many of our programs and plans through a built environment accessibility panel, which is a panel of disabled people, a full range of different impairments and conditions, and many of whom are accessing consultants. And they test our plans and proposals and project outlines for accessibility. It's also part of the DFT's requirement, so that you don't get a dispensation unless you've been through the Built Environment Accessibility Panel. So we rely on this panel that meets every 3 weeks and looks at all of our major projects and programs to really test us and challenge us to make sure that we're integrating accessibility into our stations, onto our footbridges, and any of the major works that we're doing. And I'm incredibly proud of the work that BEAT undertakes, and it's becoming more and more influential as it works across different projects and works with some of our train operating companies and also with HS2. Underpinning all of that is the accessible travel policy, which becomes active and live in April this year. This has been a real joint piece of work across train operating companies with the Office for Rail and Road, looking at how we could move what was called the DPPP, the Disabled People's Persons Protection Policy, doesn't roll off your tongue, into something that would start to identify what our disabled passengers can expect from us in terms of a good passenger experience. So it outlines the designs of our stations, the floor plans. It outlines all of the accessible facilities and where they are. It outlines what to do if the service doesn't fail, and where you can get some recompense and support. It outlines the training that and the kind of service standard that disabled passengers and older passengers can expect from us as an industry. And all of those things we are being held to account for. And we've embraced the policy in terms of integrating it into how we're approaching our work, both in terms of the diversity impact assessments, but also forthcoming training that we're offering to our people. And the picture that you also have there is the changing places facilities, which we're looking to make sure are available on our managed stations. All of these things create a much more inclusive environment, and an environment that's much more accessible to a range of diverse passengers. And so the accessible travel policy is the thing that passengers will be able to utilize to hold us to account, but also to understand what they can expect from us and what to do if things don't work. And that policy will be available in all of our stations. It will be available online, and all of the train operating companies have the same kinds of guidance and will be held to account for those same things. So we've embraced that because, as I said, that integrates the thinking around accessibility really, really clearly. It also relates to the app that we're producing and rolling out, which is designed to make passenger assistance much more intuitive and much more available to all our passengers. And on the next slide, we're talking about the training. So underpinning all of this and the questions about how do people know what to expect, how do we communicate, how do we engage with our passengers, much of it is down to us training our people, and us working highly collaboratively with our partners. So in terms of training our people, Charlie mentioned our Love Passenger initiative, which is all about how we focus on the kind of customer experience and the passenger experience. Underpinning that, we have an inclusive service training, which has the principles of the accessible travel policy integrated throughout of it. It's also delivered by disabled people, and we think that that's a really important aspect in helping our people understand the needs of disabled people, and that every disabled person is an individual and has different requirements. And so by having an approach that focuses on the individual needs, we're better equipped to provide a more inclusive service for all of our passengers. And so putting them first will be front and center of how people interact with us and how we communicate with people and how we make sure that the passenger assistance that has been booked is running well. And similarly, for those people that have turned up and want to be as independent as possible, they get any assistance that's necessary. So front and center of that is thinking about how do disabled people want to be treated? How can we make sure we communicate effectively with people in a really great way? That training can be shared with our train operating companies, but also some of the agreements that we have around how we will manage the experience of our passengers as they transit through different stations, which are managed by different entities. That working collaboratively is absolutely core to us giving a really great experience to our passengers, and also to having some consistency of standards around the levels of accessibility. A couple of the pictures that you see there, the Just a Minute card and the sunflower lanyard, which we rolled out during the COVID pandemic, have been really useful in terms of, one, educating our people about the needs of for people who's with invisible disabilities, and also the opportunity to give more time where people need it, so that we can help them according to their specific needs, rather than to our kind of stereotypical assumptions that we might make, which cause inconvenience for our passengers. So there's three things really, just to kind of remind you. It's about making sure that we put our passengers first, that we are trained, that we communicate with our passengers in a way that's respectful, engaging, welcoming, so that we add to their good experience. And even where things go wrong, we still maintain an attitude which is respectful, engaging, and welcoming to ease any discomfort or inconvenience that we might be privy to. We also want to make sure that people clearly understand what they can expect from us. And we're going to be really open about being held to account for doing that. And we've had an opportunity to kind of rehearse some of that because of the reduction in passengers during COVID. As I mentioned, there's the Passenger Assist app is going to really shift the experience for our disabled passengers in particular. We're moving now ultimately to reducing the time that people can book. So currently we're looking at a six hour window for booking the passenger assistance, and we want to move to even reduce that to at least 2 hours over time. But we have to build up our competency and confidence in providing a much more accessible service. So we've been, as I said, we've been able to kind of rehearse some of these and implement some of these changes as we've had less passengers. We've been successful so far in making that work. What we now need to do is build our capacity to make that a much more consistent experience, a consistently good experience, as we build back better and as we encourage people to take up transport as we come out of COVID. And I think that I'll draw a pause there and hand back to our chair for the next speaker. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lorraine. Your presentations generated a lot of good questions, so you might want to have a look at those so that you're ready for the Q&A session. Really positive initiatives that and a number I wasn't aware of. So, you know, congratulations on all of the work that you've been doing in the background. Obviously, it's important for to provide those facilities for people who need better accessibility. But all of that, I'm sure, all of that respect and care and so forth flows right through all of the passengers. So I think, you know, all that training will have a ripple effect as well as on the immediate target audience. So really well done. So if we move on now to our next speaker, so Simon Blaney from the University of Southampton is going to talk to us about adapting for future passenger needs. Clearly, we've got to learn how to live with COVID, and you know, we're now talking about it being like a seasonal flu. We've also got to be better prepared, I suggest, for future pandemics and other emergencies. We've had to adapt, but can we be better prepared? And how do we redesign the railway to address some of the challenges that Charlie and Anthony have highlighted to us, as well as those for accessibility highlighted by Lorraine. And to my mind, research, development, and innovation is going to be key to all of that. So, Simon, are you ready?
Yep, I'm ready to go. Thanks, David.
Okay, over to you then, Simon.
So, yes, good morning, everyone. So I'm Simon Blaney, and I'm going to share some reflections from my colleagues, William Parry, Andrew McNaughton, and myself on how the rail industry might need to adapt to future passenger needs once rail travel does become more widely available once again. So apologies for any repetition of things that have been said already. The slides are kind of locked in, and it is the challenge of going last, but I'll try not to repeat other people more than I can help. So clearly, COVID-19 has had some fairly significant impacts on the passenger rail market and will continue to do so in future once regular travel is possible again. So it does seem likely that we are, at least in part, going to see the end of the traditional 9 to 5, which has been a very big driver of how the rail industry has done things. So there is likely to be a significant reduction in at least some locations in regular commuting by office workers and white-collar business travel into the long term, and also of leisure travel perhaps in the short to medium term. But set against this, there is also potential for really quite significant growth in other markets. So perhaps less frequent but longer commute trips in the medium to long term as people reorganize their working and living arrangements, along with perhaps growth in long distance leisure travel once that does become possible once again. So I think, as we've heard already, clearly COVID-19 and its impacts are going to be with us for the medium, if not the long term. But rail does still have a very important role to play. Not least, it has a crucial task in terms of achieving transport decarbonisation. If we do want to achieve net zero by 2050, then there's going to need to be a big role for rail in that. So what I'm going to attempt to do in the next 14 minutes or so is look at the challenges and also the opportunities facing rail and how we think the rail industry might need to adapt in order to address them. So I'm going to talk about this in respect to the 4 C's, customer, capacity, cost, and carbon, but focusing particularly on customers. So I think to start with, what we will need to understand is why people will travel by train, why they will still travel by train in a post-lockdown situation. And I think there are a few reasons why people make that choice. And most of these are, to be honest, quite obvious. So firstly, and perhaps most importantly, people are likely to choose rail because it is affordable, because it presents good value, and because it is quick. And all of these things are particularly important in relative terms compared to other modes which people might consider. But aspects such as convenience, having a pleasant journey experience, having a low stress journey and a safe journey are also going to be key. I think rail will have perhaps much less of a captive market than may have been the case in some sectors in the past. So there does need to be a shift perhaps in how rail thinks about its passengers. which I think we will have a situation where far fewer people will be using train because they have no alternative. So we won't have a situation where people are effectively forced to use rail as a distress purchase because they simply have no other option for the trips they have to make. So what might we need to do? Well, let's start with safety, and particularly COVID safety, because obviously physical separation is now a key concern, and this is likely to remain the case in at least the medium term. So we might want to look at things like how we can reconfigure seat spacings on our rolling stock, perhaps consider greater compartmentalization of passenger space to give people a feeling of physical separation from others. Clearly, cleaning is now increasingly important, so we might want to think about how we can redesign carriage interiors to allow easier cleaning. And then in terms of reducing transmission, there's clearly perhaps a need in some circumstances to reconfigure air conditioning systems to allow maximum exchange and to carefully manage passenger flows both within and on and off vehicles. And the rail industry is doing some of these things already. And it's about actual safety, but actually perceived safety is probably even more important, just because people's perceptions are what will determine primarily whether or not they are happy to travel by rail. So I think this is likely to mean that train capacity per vehicle will be substantially reduced, but this does also present opportunities to perhaps reverse a recent trend towards increasing passenger densities at maybe the expense of comfort, and focusing once again more on providing a pleasant passenger experience. And I know this is something of a stereotyped thing to look at, but nonetheless, when you look at this change in focus from increasing density towards increasing pleasure, it is still instructive to compare the changing passenger environment on trains over the last 30, 40 years compared to the changing passenger environment on train's main competitor, which is the private car, because one has, I think, advanced significantly faster than the others in terms of the facilities that it provides to passengers. So what might this pleasant railway look like? Well, as I've said already, we might want to look at reducing seat densities. We might want to look at ways of increasing the provision of supplementary facilities, so most obviously tables, but also other things that can perhaps increase passenger comfort. May want to increase the comfort of seats, although I'm aware this is a bit of a contentious issue as to what does actually comprise the most comfortable seat. But I think we'll also need to consider the needs of specific markets. The pleasant railway won't look the same everywhere, so we do need to think about local and sort of flow specific needs when we're considering this area. And as I've said already, we need to consider what is provided by competing modes and making sure that rail is at least comparable. So the second thing to think about is clearly journey times, which will still be very important, particularly where rail has significant competition from other modes. So the most obvious thing there to do is to target journey time improvements for flows where rail is currently uncompetitive. But I think it's also important that we do avoid becoming over-fixated on point-to-point timings for centre-to-centre journeys. We need to look at station-to-station journeys, including connection and waiting times, but also probably door-to-door journey times, because when you're looking at your competitiveness with other modes, it is that door-to-door journey time which probably people are going to be most focused on. So we do need to look at ways in which we can improve journey times for door-to-door trips, but also in particular try to improve journey times for those parts of the journey that do have a particularly high disutility per minute. And actually this often isn't the time that people are spending on board trains, it's the time they're spending interchanging or waiting around for trains on tolled platforms. So a focus on access and connectivity and egress is likely to be quite crucial. Now, this has been termed the challenge of the last 5 miles, and I'll illustrate this quickly using an example based on the city where I normally work, which is Southampton. So journey times to and from the 2 main stations in Southampton, Central and Airport Parkway, to other major cities in the UK are generally pretty competitive. But the problem arises when you actually need to get to the stations that are local to the places where many of the city's residents live. So I'll use the example here of Netley, which you can see ringed in red towards the bottom of that map. So this table, when I can move my slide on, apologies. I may need some technical assistance here, as I seem to have, for some reason, lost control. There we go, thank you. So this table shows illustrative journey times from Southampton Central to 4 major destinations. And you can see that actually these journey times to Southampton Central look pretty competitive. But when you then add on the 5-mile additional journey to get to Netley, you see that you're getting a hugely disproportionate increase in journey time for a very short additional distance. And that's before you then take into account the time to get from the station to your final destination. So when you are considering the whole door-to-door journey, suddenly rail has become much less competitive with the car. And we're not really learning this lesson, I don't think, because we are building this kind of problem still into new infrastructure. So, for example, to take a high-profile example, we're terminating High Speed 2 at Curzon Street in Birmingham for reasons that I understand. But what you're thereby doing is imposing a much longer and more complicated interchange on passengers who are wanting to access other destinations in the West Midlands via Birmingham New Street. So in doing this, you're actually throwing away a good chunk of the journey time savings that are delivered by the high speed element of the journey, while also making people spend time on an element of the journey, interchange, which has a higher disutility. So journey time's important, door-to-door journey time's important, but providing a stress-free journey is also important. And there's a range of things we need to think about here. So clearly providing the right information at the right time, that's been mentioned quite a bit already. Considering all levels of ability to access information. So focusing on the different needs of people with different levels of ability. A renewed focus on punctuality is clearly going to be important. There have been great gains achieved in this during the pandemic. We need to try and retain those as passenger numbers come up again. Also ensuring the reliability of onboard service provision. So things like free Wi-Fi or power sockets. If your customers are expecting these, it's crucial they actually get them, because they will remember the one time that they weren't available rather than the 9 times when they were, particularly if they had an important presentation to prepare for on that journey. And then finally, I've covered this already, but interchange within and between modes is important for journey times. It's also important for low stress and customer satisfaction as well. So ultimately what we're focusing on in all these things is trying to make rail the travel mode of choice, targeting interventions at specific contexts and recognizing that there are unlikely to be many one-size-fits-all solutions. So that's customer. Moving on now to cost. The first aspect I'm going to consider here could actually also have been considered as part of the customer category, and this is the issue of ticket prices, which has already been mentioned. But because rail is still hugely uncompetitive in cost terms for many journeys, particularly when more than one person is travelling. And again, here's a sample pre-COVID example. So 3 of my colleagues needed to get to Nottingham for a late morning meeting. The rail ticket price on the most convenient journey option was £744 for the 3 of them, whereas the car price was much less than that. And I appear to have lost control again. Apologies. Can we have the next slide? So yeah, the cost, the complete cost of a car journey, including car hire, was £62.80 for 3 people. So there's no prizes for getting which option my colleagues chose. So I do think, as has been said already, we need a genuine overhaul of the fares system. We need to make sure in doing this that we don't remove flexibility, because this is a key advantage for the car. And we need to make sure that we don't just assume smart ticketing will fix everything, because it won't. And as well as reducing costs for the passenger, we also need to reduce industry costs, because these will obviously influence the prices that are charged to passengers. So things to look at might be working with employers to try and spread the peaks to encourage flexible working and thereby reduce our peak capacity costs. Try and reduce some of the transaction costs associated with industry fragmentation, but in doing this, make sure that we don't compromise quality. And then moving on to our third C, capacity. So I think there is going to need to be a change in focus here on what we invest in, and maybe scale back our focus on improving capacity required to accommodate with historic peaks, which are no longer there, and focus more on capital projects to accommodate mode shift and perhaps also a mixed use railway. So this is likely to involve some carefully prioritised line reopenings, again focusing on the needs of specific contexts, but also things like adopting use appropriate standards for the new infrastructure we do build, and trying to plan rail as part of an integrated public transport system rather than as a standalone system. And then, finally, carbon. So if part of our rationale for getting people onto rail is based on sustainability, then we do obviously need to continue to focus on rail's carbon footprint. So this includes things like prioritising electrification, moving towards a whole life assessment of carbon costs. But ultimately, if we can achieve significant mode shift from car and particularly air, then this will do quite a bit of the work for us. That is, the biggest way to reduce carbon is to get people out of their cars and onto trains. So that goes back to many of the things that have been said already. So I'm aware of running out of time. I will just quickly note that while I have primarily focused on passengers, freight is also important. So there are things that we can do to make passenger and rail freight work better together, and I think this is an area that will need to be looked at, partly because in doing this we can actually reduce the pressure on revenue by trying to facilitate mixed operations, ways in which we can make clever use of spare passenger capacity to carry high value freight. And I think this is an area where perhaps research could be focused to try and help address some of the cost challenges which we may face as a result of losing some of those peak passenger flows. But I will move on now just to some summary points to stop me going into the time for questions. So I think there is clearly going to be a continuing role for rail going forward, especially if we can achieve significant mode shift from the car. But patterns of travel and key markets are undoubtedly going to change, and rail needs to change its offer to reflect that. I do think we may need to increase the role for freight and sharing freight and passenger traffic in a way which we haven't done before within the same trains potentially. We do need to see the spreading of peaks as being a positive opportunity, a way to reduce some of the pressures that have faced the industry previously. And similarly, while there is a need to reduce passenger densities on trains, this perhaps does give us an opportunity to improve the journey experience. We do need to address cost, both for passengers and the industry. Clearly, revisions to the fare structure should be a priority. And we do also need to address our carbon footprint, particularly through whole life carbon accounting. So ultimately, what we want to try to do is to build for mode shift, build towards a mixed use railway, and there are some great research challenges to address in achieving that. But I'll finish there. Thank you for your attention, and I will hand back to David.
Thank you very much, Simon. What a great message to end on. Modal shift and mixed use railway. What's not to like about that? So thank you very much for an excellent overview of the landscape and the challenges going forward. I'm really pleased that our speakers, as I would hope from people, rail industry people, we're really positive, actually, I think, is the undercurrent about the railway, but realistic about the challenges that we have going forward. So can I just ask all the speakers to be on camera again? And excellent. And we have got some great questions from the audience. If we can, the first one I'll go for is to Charlie, I think. There's a question here about potentially the rail's offer can come across negative to the passenger from start to finish is the challenge. Confusing bookings and pricing. Simon talked about some of that. He talked about the choices that logical people make to not use the railway. And the challenge from the question is compare this to new entrants like Uber. So are we too fragmented to compete? Charlie, what are your thoughts? And I'd also like to ask Anthony to come in on that when Charlie's given us her thoughts.
Yeah, thanks for that. No, I don't think we are too fragmented. I think what the COVID crisis actually has shown us is how well we can work together as one industry. You know, that collaboration piece has got to be key to taking it forward for the future. So certainly I know that I'm very heavily involved with the whole industry strategic plan. We're working very closely with top colleagues, with focus groups, obviously with Anthony and his team. You know, we want to make sure that when our passengers do come back, and I have every confidence they will come back, that we're ready for them and we've got a positive message to tell them. You know, we have to look to the future. Reform is around the corner. We're hoping to hear that there's a white paper at some point in the next few weeks, and that I think will kind of point us in the right direction. I'm confident we've got the skill set, the innovation, the knowledge, and the want to do this. And we want to make sure that we are completely putting passengers and freight users and customers and end users first, you know, and it's not just, you know, we have to kind of put it into action now. So, yeah, I think we've got a challenge along the way, and I'm sure it's going to be a bumpy road, but at the same time, I'm actually seeking every crisis has opportunity, and I see this as a massive opportunity for the rail industry.
Fantastic, Charlie. Anthony, what about the challenge that other modes are easier to work with, you know, Uber versus rail, or, you know, Simon had the example of, you know, rational academics making the choice to hire a car rather than use the train.
Yes, I like the rational academics phrase. That's great. I think you're quite right. Uber has a brilliantly simple customer proposition. You're five minutes away, 20 quid. Do you want it? Simple as that. Click here, payment done, all sorted. You know what you're getting. You know where your driver is. Obviously, the railway as a public service, which it is, which it remains, will never quite be like that. But I think the shift to digital we've seen in the last 10 months and the shift towards that sort of simplicity of message will be absolutely crucial. And I think it really harks back to a point that Simon made about flexibility. The rail's competitor will be the car to a degree. Cars are brilliantly flexible. The current ticketing structure does not underpin that. Try explaining to anybody in a pub why the off-peak single is 10p less than the off-peak return. It's incomprehensible. But we've got to build that flexibility back in the future, because we've drifted towards a reservation-only longer distance railway. And whilst that might suit conditions at the moment, that's not going to last forever. And one of the brilliant successes of the last few years has been the frequency that railways have built up. I know that's strained the timetable, but the frequency is amazing. You don't need a timetable across large swathes of the country. That is flexibility. And if we can pin the ticketing structure to that, even better. Fragmentation, I think, is an interesting one. Hideously complicated industries like airports and airlines, the NHS, they're all fragmented. What they mustn't appear is fragmented to the user. Nobody is interested in seeing how it's all stitched together. In our currently fragmented structure, people like Grand Central, Hull Trains, East Coast, Virgin, Great Western, getting great leisure scores, long distance, really top scores. And so it's not about the knitting behind the scenes, it's about how it appears to the customer. And don't forget, white paper coming along, we might see more concentration of power. Is that going to be quite as customer responsive for the passenger? Very interesting challenge.
Really good point about not being fragmented to the user, because one thing that the Ubers of this world have is total and utter control over their whole end-to-end process. And, you know, there's not too many interfaces in that. So, you know, how do we as an industry replicate that and be as slick as our competitors are? Turning to Lorraine now. Lorraine, you'll have seen you've generated quite a few questions. You might want to merge a few together, but there's several are about how can you, and you talked about this in your presentation, how can we really give more respect and dignity to passengers? How do we help those that need to self-declare, and how do we promote that? So just you covered that in your presentation, but I just, you know, if you wanted to say the 2 or 3 things that we could do as individuals in the industry and collectively.
Thank you, David. I think specifically to the question around declaring, I think that's one of the things that we need to remove. So in terms of our customer service training, we don't focus on people's impairments. We focus on what do you need from us and where are you trying to get to? And that has to be a kind of mind shift for us as delivering a service to our customers. Is there is information that we don't actually need. What we might need is if there's some specific assistance points that you need, that's all that we need to know. So the need to self-declare kind of is removed, and I think the issue of dignity and enabling people to be themselves and to be as independent as possible sits at the heart of providing a really good customer service. So the compunction is on us as the rail industry, is to train our people to put the needs of the customer first, rather than necessarily need to understand their particular conditions. There's also a really good point about the need to promote the sunflower lanyard scheme much better. And I absolutely agree that that's something that we can do. And that's an iterative process. So on one hand, that's a kind of self-declaration. If you're wearing a lanyard or you have a jam card, you're kind of indicating that you need some assistance. That's fantastic. So again, it's the communication campaign. It's training our colleagues. It's training the public, in a sense, to understand what those signatures mean. There was also a question, David, if you want me to address it, around diversity impact assessments.
I was going to ask you that. Yes, please, if you could. Yes.
So yeah, the short answer is it ought to be done by the East-West Alliance in specifically, and we recently had a judgment against us by the EHRC for not undertaking diversity impact assessments, and this was not for a train station that we manage. So the diversity impact assessments are becoming more and more important and becoming an actual requirement, particularly for Network Rail, and one that we kind of delegated to our train operating companies. And so we expect to see those being undertaken much more. And we are making sure that people have the requisite training in order to undertake our diversity impact assessments. So they are being applied more. And they also give us assurance that we've got the right arrangements in place if and when we're doing either renewals or we're introducing new services or new programs.
And just a quick question, I guess that I was going to ask a question about, you talked about inclusive design, and obviously that's really positive going forward, but we've got a significant legacy infrastructure, but presumably you pick up the sort of challenges of the legacy infrastructure through the impact assessments. Is that
in part, and where we come up, and again, the beauty of the inclusive design principles is it puts the passenger front and center of what we're thinking about. So where we're doing renewals, if we're redesigning a station, or if we're rebuilding a footbridge, we have to use a diversity impact assessment in order to understand what the effects of what we're doing is going to be on a raft of different passenger usages. So yeah, the inclusive design principles are absolutely key. And as we go through our renewal programs, we can integrate those. And it's also a site for innovation, because there might be solutions that we haven't considered that we're kind of driven to think about.
That's great. Thank you, Lorraine, for turning now to, I want to bring in Simon, but also other colleagues on the call. Charlie and Anthony will no doubt have a view about this. You raised the question, Simon, quite clearly about the proverbial last 5 miles. And there's a question coming with pointing to that about how do we think the rail industry can work better together with other modes of transport to support the first and last mile. Simon, you set the challenge. Actually, maybe if I turn first to Charlie and ask your thoughts about what is going on in the industry. Are we looking out beyond the railway fence and talking to our effectively competitors and in looking for collaboration there?
I would say not everywhere. I think in pockets they are doing really well. So I know, for instance, having worked with Transport for Edinburgh as a non-exec, that's something that's really high on their radar and it's high on their agenda. I certainly think from a pandemic point of view, we've had to do that. We've had to integrate better. We've had to look at different ways of merging people getting from A to B. So certainly from my point of view, when we talk about it from a Network Rail point of view, we try to be as inclusive as we can. We want to make sure that that first and last mile is definitely covered. We, see stations, for instance, which is part of my portfolio, as, a big part of the community. And, I've talked to a variety of different people who have said to me, if they have a disability or if they have a buggy, they have a bike, it's sometimes difficult to get across the road, for instance, just to get from A to B, but there's also big stations across the network that interlink with tram. We have buses, underground. So I think we could do better. It's certainly on my radar. And my team are looking at the best way we can integrate. So we're trying to involve as many passengers and customers' views we can.
So, being as this is an innovation conference, I'll give Simon notice that in a minute I'm going to come to him and ask him what are the 2 or 3 things that you think we could do in this space to help with the last mile, and Anthony, I'm going to come to you now, and it occurs to, it's occurred to me, it's certainly been an observation I've made in the past, that if other transport operators get their act together and offer a proper end-to-end service, whether it's under the banner of mobility as a service or whatever, they will eat our lunch. They'll leave us for dust. So what are your thoughts, Anthony, about are we sufficiently collaborative with the other modes, and could we do better? You are also responsible for you're responsible for more than rail. What are your thoughts?
It's a good challenge. It's a good question. I think what you mustn't forget is the success that there has been in terms of park and ride in the last few years. The number of car parking spaces at stations has expanded dramatically. They're relatively cheap to deck and to do, and they fill up pretty quickly. There's a great unmet demand there, but I think that's an indication of much deeper unmet demand across all types of access. Whenever you put in new bike facilities, especially if you tell people about them, they fill up really quickly. Bus interchange can be improved, even though I think sometimes it's slightly overplayed because most bus passengers don't want to go anywhere near a train station, and usually vice versa. But I think it is worth just remembering park and ride, and also the rise of electric vehicles is going to be important. People will need to charge up. They will need access to electricity. It can become one of the great selling points of the railway. Park here, plug in, when you come back, you're ready to go again, whatever you want to do. So don't forget vehicle access, I think, in that debate. Really
good points. So Simon, what are your thoughts about the 2 or 3 things that you would see making a difference here?
Go on then. I'll give you 3 quickly. So first of all, I think you need to look at common conditions of carriage. So what I mean here is, if, for example, I go to get the bus to catch my train, but the bus gets stuck in traffic on the way to the station, if I've got a train specific ticket, they might not let me on the train. I might have to buy a new ticket. So having proper end-to-end journey conditions of carriage, so that if one element of your journey is delayed, you're not stuck or forced to pay extra money. So looking at ways to enable that. Secondly, I'd say trying to plan different transport systems as an integrated whole, like they do in Switzerland. We do that quite well in some parts of the UK, not in others. But then the third one I think I'd focus on is looking at how you can integrate rail planning and land use planning, and particularly looking to build transit-oriented development around existing infrastructure assets. So we've got quite a lot of not particularly well used land around stations, maybe including the airspace over stations. Can we put in new residential or commercial facilities there that then build in rail as an obvious mode of travel? I think that would be quite an important thing that is done in other places quite well, not so much here. So that's my 3 suggestions quickly.
Goodness me, land use planning. Yeah, it's sort of, people used to build railways where people wanted to go. So I've got a question here for Charlie. I'll try and paraphrase it. I think what the question is asking really is about, given we've got potentially, certainly at the moment, reduced capacity and therefore reduced revenue, and then looking to the future, there is the kind of ticketing options that Anthony talked about, which might bring numbers back but might not bring revenue back. Do we have a challenge as the industry to sort of be more efficient, deliver more efficiently, live in straightened times, but still deliver the goods? And how do we go about doing that collectively?
I think for one, you're absolutely right, you know, and Anthony made a good point about when passengers come back, we don't know what it looks like, you know. Leisure seems to be the way forward, and lots of people are changing their marketing strategies according to that. You know, I've said it in the past, Network Rail are renowned for doing engineering works over periods of time like Easter, Christmas, bank holidays. We might have to look at where we go destination-wise from a train operating company point of view, changing timetables. I think express freight is something that's certainly on the radar as well, because, you know, that for me is high on my agenda. And I think every business development opportunity that we can look at, we have to put it on the table at the moment. You know, we want this industry to survive. We know we've got a challenge ahead. And, you know, if we don't get passengers back, we need to look at every opportunity that we can. So I think we've had complex ticketing for years and years. That needs to be simplified. We need to make it far more easy. I like the fact that, you know, everybody on this today has said we have to be more agile. Absolutely. I think if we can be agile, flexible, and be at pace and keep up with what, you know, customer expectations are, then we'll get through this. But we need to kind of start thinking a little bit more innovatively. And, you know, for me, as I say, the opportunity at managed stations to have express freight, to work collaboratively, you know, with the freight community is certainly something that I see being very much at the forefront while we try and attract and welcome back our passengers.
Thank you. Anthony, do you just want to quick add to that?
Just a very quick point. I think cost reduction in the railways for a whole variety of reasons is actually really difficult. Therefore, I think the emphasis we've had today on growing the market is going to be absolutely crucial, because at the moment, the imbalance between the government investment and the revenue is massive, and that has got to be closed.
You're quite right. You know, in any business, if you're in a challenge as we are, then you've got to look at both costs and revenue, and growing the revenue is one way out of a challenge. The Project Speed conference that was mentioned earlier, and the link's been shared. I mean, the message there is half the time and slash the cost. That's what we're trying to do as an industry, and avoid some of the waste that we see and unnecessary activity and cost we see in programs. And, you know, so it's a physician heal thyself scenario, I think, there. So if I can just draw things to a close, could I ask colleagues so next we're going to move into an informal Zoom session, and I hope some of the speakers might be able to join us for the networking and let the conversation carry on. I took the liberty of sharing the document that we published that Charlie mentioned about the 10 reasons to continue to invest in rail. And I'm just going to pick 5 out of that, which I think are particularly pertinent to the conversation that we've had today, just as a way of rounding things out. So, you know, we're taking the view, and I think the speakers have validated this, that the reduction in passenger numbers is likely to be temporary. Rail is not just for passengers. We've mentioned freight, and freight is one of the revenue raising ways that we might bring money back into the industry. Rail is clean and safe. We have to get that message out when the government allow us to encourage people back on trains. That has to be a key message. I think Anthony mentioned that once we got over the pandemic emergency, we've got a climate emergency, and rail can lead the green recovery. We are the mode that has a solution to decarbonisation. And last I think I've mentioned 5 out of 10, so you look at the others at your leisure, but last and by no means least is rail investment has a knock-on economic impact. When we want to build back better, our analysis says that for every £1 you spend on the railway, you get £2.20 in the wider economy. You know, what's not to like about that? You know, so as you know, let's look to the future of the railway positively, and let's look to the innovators in the industry to help us forward. Just to remind you, this afternoon we've got a Stations of the Future networking session to exchange ideas around what that might look like. And if closing out now, then it just remains for me to thank my fantastic panel of speakers. You've all been great, really appreciate it, as I'm sure the audience do, as you could tell from the quality of the questions. So thank you once again, and over to the informal Zoom session. Is the link in the chat, or where is the link? What's the latest on the link then? Could my colleagues share the link? We'll send it later. Okay, right, thank you. So, so the audience, if you watch out for the link, it will be appearing. So thank you very much, everybody.